Good morning. I'm Myron Brilliant. I'm the Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs here at the U.S. Chamber. It's a pleasure to join you on day one of our global forum. We're already off to a fantastic start. And I want to thank our Chamber President and CEO, Suzanne Clark, for kicking things off this morning. As Suzanne said in her opening remarks, the challenges we face around the world today are real, they're serious, and they require close coordination between the private sector and the public sector. Free enterprise is the ultimate competitive advantage. At the same time, free enterprise cannot be taken for granted anywhere and must be nurtured and protected everywhere. This is especially important as the world seems to be growing more complex by the day. That includes all the issues we're well aware of. Russia's shocking invasion of Ukraine, obviously the effects of China's non-market economic policies and practices, Europe's dramatic efforts to wean itself off Russian energy, the looming food security crisis we face around the world, climate change, the need for real robust actions there, supply chain snarls, digitalization of the economy, the world economy, and a wave of inflation. It's a great deal to take in. All these things have a dramatic impact on companies' ability to produce and sell goods and services around the world. This morning, we're so fortunate to set the stage for the remainder of the summit and look at these geostrategic landscape with three very dynamic people who bring tremendous insights and expertise to really bring bear on these important topics to date. Let me begin by saying we're going to dispense with long introductions in the interest of time because all three speakers have really extensive credentials and are highly regarded in their fields. Let me start really by an introduction of the first two guests. I'm delighted that Ambassador Heng Chee is with us. She's one of Singapore's most accomplished and experienced diplomats and one of the most prominent and respected diplomats in all of Asia. And I don't say that lightly. She's a longtime friend of the U.S. Chamber and of myself. We worked very closely during her time as Singapore's longest serving ambassador to the United States. During her tenure, bilateral relations between our countries improved dramatically. And among her many, many accomplishments, and I underline accomplishments, she oversaw the enactment of the U.S.-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. She was also Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations. And today she's ambassador at large with Singapore's foreign ministry, where she is sitting for this interview as we speak. Ian Bremmer is our other first guest on this session. He is president and founder of the Eurasia Group, a leading political risk analysis and consulting firm. He's built it into one of the best, I would say, political risk analysis firms in the world, not just in the United States. He's widely quoted commentator on geopolitics, regularly stirring the pot. And you'll see that today, I'm sure, with his thought-provoking social media posts, and also, obviously, a highly regarded author. I want to just hold up his newest book. I'm very proud to be holding it, but I want to read it thoroughly. I've already glanced at it. His newest book, The Power of Crisis, will be released next week on May 17th. And he already got a phenomenal reference from the Financial Times. I know it will be a bestseller, because all of you are going to run out and buy a copy after listening to this conversation. Ian is known, as I said, for his provocative commentaries, and I'm sure he'll be no different today. Following the conversation with Ambassador Chan and Ian, we'll hear from Ambassador John Huntsman, and I'll say more about him in a few minutes. So let me begin and get going on this interview. Ambassador Chan, let me start with you. Obviously, foreign policy pundits see the world politically and economically decoupling into two blocks. The West, however, defined as one side, and China, Russia, and other authoritarian states on the other. I want to ask you, what's your perspective on the pressures towards decoupling? Is this really where we're heading? And I also want to ask the role of countries like Singapore to work more constructively to make sure we confront global challenges, seize opportunities, and find ways to work together. Ambassador Chan, your thoughts?
Thank you, Myron. You can think of decoupling in two senses. In the geopolitical decoupling that seems to be taking place or threatening to take place, and in the geoeconomic decoupling. Now, the Ukraine war, in fact, forced a pop-up new world order with the United States and Europe on the one side and China and Russia on the other side. Now, when you look at the UN vote happening at that time, many countries, in fact, 141 countries voted to uphold the UN Charter. They were against territorial violation of territorial integrity and so on. But when it came to the sanctions, far fewer countries adopted sanctions. It was really the Western countries with their allies. Singapore was the outlier there, but we had very special reasons. And because of our geostrategic reason, I believe very many countries want to belong to what I call a third space. That is, they don't want to take sides with simply just the US and the West or China and Russia. They reserve the right, they want to reserve the right and independence to support a US initiative and Western initiative if it's in their interest, or a Chinese and Russian initiative if it is in their interest. And they do this because they have a sense of agency, they have a sense of their self-interest, and they don't think it's contradictory. And I think as time goes on, we're beginning to see this grouping. It's not organized, but I say they belong to a third space. Now, the United States has projected the world and the Western allies as democracies versus autocracies. I've always thought that that's not a very good way of dividing the world. You certainly don't gain the most allies that way. You get a lot of people signing up to say, I want to uphold the UN Charter, and you cannot violate the UN Charter. But signing up democracies, autocracies, well, a lot of countries will be left out of it. A lot of countries that the United States wants to mobilize on your side, say on the Ukraine war. And I find it very strange because many of America's most dependent strategic defense partners, your military bases, are located in autocracies, in monarchies. So you can't just say democracies versus autocracies. In any case, and I'm sure Ian will agree with me, these days, democracy needs reform. Democracy has degraded even in the home of democracies. And Americans, Europeans, the British, they've written about their own countries. And they say this is badly in need of reform, the democracies. But the strength of democracy is that people can say that, But so I don't think you should pursue the route of democracy versus autocracy. Now on decoupling, geoeconomic decoupling, I'll say this very quickly because this will come up again. The decoupling was taking place. I think it started more with President Trump's administration, the pushing of the trade war and the tech war. And that's going on. But whether you can really decouple remains to be seen. This is against China and the US. And China too, I think, is looking for decoupling. But the thing about these two, the United States and China, is that unlike the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the United States and China are very interdependent in their economies. The United States and the Soviet Union, there wasn't that much economic interaction. You were in different systems. So I think it may be a little harder for the decoupling to take place geoeconomically. And let's see what happens, because I think, there's concern about tech security, and the decoupling may take place in the tech space. But if you defend that security in terms of national security too broadly, it's not going to be helpful. And third countries like us, we watch what's going on, and we think, why is the United States and China impoverishing each other and impoverishing the world by decoupling in this way? Do build high walls, if you must, around small gardens, the really sensitive tech space, but don't build high walls in a big field. It's not very helpful. Anyway, the pandemic has also helped or hastened further decoupling that's happening. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, so let's jump in. First, I want to agree with Ambassador Chen very strongly that the framing of this conflict as one of autocracies versus democracies is decidedly unhelpful. Both for the reason that she mentioned, because the developing world is not on board with it. There's no international community on this issue. There is advanced industrial democracies together, and that's about it. But also because there are many things, many ways that the United States leads the world very well, like in the global reserve currency and its financial sector, like in a lot of technological innovation, like in energy production, for example. I mean, lots of global military capabilities. Democracy is not one of them. Used to be in 1989 when the wall came down, but presently that's the weakest suit in America's hand. And unfortunately, most political leaders in Washington don't understand or agree with that. They don't know how much that position has been damaged in the eyes, not just of allies around the world, but of a whole bunch of, sort of more neutral states. And so I think it's really counterproductive to frame it that way. Now, on the decoupling issue, I think there are three different areas of decoupling that are going on, and it is important to differentiate them. Area one is Russia. And Russia, because of its decision to unilaterally invade a sovereign country that has done nothing wrong other than to want to exist and vote in its own government, the Russians are being severed from the West. Politically, economically, culturally, you name it. It's the first time a G20 economy has ever had that done to it. And yeah, it's the United States, it's Japan, it's South Korea, it's Singapore, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's almost all of Europe. That is absolutely permanent. And the damage that will do to the peace dividend is permanent. The damage that will do to Europe is permanent. That's a really big deal. Russia's being decoupled from the West, and I don't think you can fix it. And the speech that we saw Putin give on May 9th on Victory Day makes it very clear that there's no pathway back there. Then there's a second component of decoupling, which is what we see happening between the United States and China, which really isn't related to this Russia issue at all. I don't think it was started by Trump. I personally think in many ways it was started by China deciding that a lot of the most powerful countries in the United States, companies in the United States, tech companies, weren't going to have access to China. I mean, companies like Google and Facebook that desperately wanted access to China, and the Chinese government said, nope, that's not aligned with our political and economic model. We're not going to have any of it. And I think since then, the Americans, Democrats and Republicans, have started to see China as much more of an adversary. They don't have as uniform the same support for integration and interdependence from Western corporations. And as a consequence, we are seeing more of a push for decoupling, both from China and from the United States. It is deeply unhelpful to both countries that those trends are occurring. I agree with Ambassador Chan that you want to have very high walls with very, very, sort of carefully tended gardens that are important for national security, but not the broad trends that we're presently seeing, which are dangerous and which need to be prevented. But there are no political interests in doing so because it goes against popular support in the United States and frankly in China too. And then you have the third area, which is the world. It's populism. There's just no support for free trade in lots of populations where you have growing economic inequality. And we see that in the United States, but we see it in other countries around the world too. And the protectionism that you see, especially in an environment of growing inequality, is very dangerous. And that really does start to change the trajectory of 50 years of globalization that not only was enormously beneficial to the United States government and US corporations that the chamber represents, but also was enormously beneficial to the emergence of a global middle class. In fact, I would argue that's a much more important beneficiary and outcome, and probably the single most positive development that humanity has ever been responsible for that we now are collectively undoing.
Ian and Ambassador Chen, both of you have touched upon different aspects of the decoupling, but I want to, Ian, go back to you quickly on your last point about the impact on the American business community. Just a sense from you, I mean, if we're going to head into a Cold War on technology and security, particularly with China and Russia, what does it really mean for the American business community? What would you be projecting to this global audience? What can we do about it? How do we mitigate the risks?
I think Russia and China are different. To mitigate the risk, what do you want to do? You want to really focus on specifying where the areas are that are dangerous, where the areas are that are around national security. So when you have a member of the Biden administration, Deputy National Security Advisor, saying, let's find a way to reduce tariffs between the United States and China because all it's doing is hurting consumers in both countries, that shouldn't be something they say sotto voce that then gets shot down. That should be a no-brainer. It's good for the global economy. It's good for our companies. And frankly, it also helps to avoid war because we need interdependence. You know, you're much more likely to blow somebody up when they're not relevant to you. Why was it so easy for the Americans to put all the sanctions against Russia? Why was it so much harder for the Germans, the French? Because there was more interdependence. Now, frankly, in the case of the United States, the West, and China, that interdependence long-term for countries that we expect to actually have staying power is extremely important. So that's what the policy should be. Also, I am a firm believer that we are not in a Cold War with China right now. I disagree with people like Neil Ferguson that have made the other argument. And one of the reasons for that is because the American political system is most captured by its special interests. And that includes a lot of people that are on this call today. And they have the ability to prevent the United States government not only from doing smart things sometimes, but also from doing stupid things sometimes. It just prevents the US government from taking action. And so the fact that you have this strong populist narrative in the US, it really is constrained by a whole bunch of strong vested interests that says, no, I will lose significantly for my mission to my shareholders if you persist. And given that I pay you most of the money that you get to get reelected, you better listen to me. I think that's still relevant in the United States.
You know, Myron, if I may get a word in here.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think, Myron, adding to what can be done, you know, I would say that Singapore, and my prime minister was just in Washington recently, we've been urging that the United States and China should get together and talk. You don't talk enough, and you don't talk anymore. When I was ambassador in Washington, there were 130 dialogues, you know, at all levels, at least, going on. Now it's finished, gone. It's not there. And so you need to talk, and countries like us can help by sometimes coming to the United States. We can talk about trade. We try to say the things you cannot say, and many sensible Americans would want to say, and make the case for why the United States should take up trade, because trade is strategic, and you have a place in Asia, and you must be there. And your IPEF, your Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, we try to help you flesh out, you know, all your different pillars. You talk of fair and resilient trade, infrastructure, supply chain resilience, decarbonization, so on. We want you to bring in digital trade. And when you say high standards, you want everybody in, or very high standards that only the developed economies can be part of. So we're trying to sort of bring some realism, perhaps, into the conversation, and we hope that's helpful.
Well, I think, look, I agree with a lot of what both of you have said. Ian, certainly, I agree with you. We should be taking those tariffs down. You talk about the dysfunction in our political system in the United States as hindering U.S. global leadership. I agree with that. Ambassador Chan, there's no question that the U.S. Chamber believes that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework has to have a digital component to it. But frankly, we would put market access on the table in order to show the countries in Southeast Asia our commitment to recognizing their needs in this initiative and to really bring U.S. leadership back into the region. If I could
You are
ask both of you.
absolutely, yeah, sorry,
Go ahead,
Myron,
go
you're
ahead.
absolutely right, because I thought, a couple of decades ago in the 80s, we always said, you want to promote democracy, democracy and trade go hand in hand together. If you don't give market access and, you don't show how democracy can be generous, why would people want to embrace the system? So if you're there to promote democracy, you really have to bring in the trade market access element.
Ian, why can't this country demonstrate leadership on economic issues, on trade, on supply chain, on other issues that require a unified U.S. government approach? Congress, the administration working obviously with the private sector. Why aren't we more responsive to the needs of this time?
Well, I mean, the main reason is because the U.S. federal government is by far the most divided and dysfunctional of the advanced industrial democracies. And by the way, to bring in something really controversial, the Roe versus Wade issue is now going to make that much worse. The Supreme Court, which used to be much less politicized, now you get justices and they're only voted on by people from one party as opposed to the other, and they're seen as political actors. And it used to be for the last decades, you didn't have to have abortion as a political issue in the state. Now, all of those states, it's going to become a tribal issue going forward. It's going to rip apart and make even greater divisions. So, what you have is a country where Democrats and Republicans increasingly see each other as the principal adversaries that they have, even more so than international adversaries in many cases. And that means that when a new administration comes in, a new party comes into Congress, they do everything possible to undermine and destroy that domestic enemy and to undo everything that has been done, good, bad, or indifferent, by the previous administration. How can you possibly talk about long-term constructive strategic policy in that environment? No, you can block stupid things from happening, but you cannot take on a strategic proactive agenda. And this is where Xi Jinping is effective, because he'll say, when you talk about climate change, look, you know that if I say I'm going to do by 2060 net zero, I'm going to do net zero by 2060. You have no idea what the Americans are going to do from one administration to the next. I hate to say it, because I'm no fan of the Chinese political system, but he's right on that issue. And it's hard for the Americans to be coherent. The Americans say we're going to do an Iranian nuclear deal, and then we back off of it. And now we don't know if we can do it again, or a Paris Climate Accord, or a World Health Organization, or Trans-Pacific Partnership. I can go on and on and on. There are a lot of great things about America, but the federal U.S. government and the way it projects rule of law, legitimacy, consistency, and leadership around the world is no longer an American superpower. And the faster that American leaders, political leaders, are prepared to recognize that, admit to it, and address it, the better off we'll be.
Ambassador Chan, I want to move to a little deeper conversation around digitalization and regulation, and we don't have a lot of time, but what I want to ask you, and of course I'm going to ask Ian as well, because Ambassador Chan, I should recognize as chair of the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, and in Singapore. I want to ask you to comment really frankly on what's happening in the AI and emerging technology space, and frankly linked to social media. How do you think we can move forward in harmony in creating innovation and building out opportunities for addressing poverty, climate reduction, all these issues that are so front and center in the minds of everyone, when we have merging disruptions in the systems of regulation? The United States has one system, Europe has another, China has strict controls in these areas. What are you seeing from your vantage point, and what should we be doing together? And Ian, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Let me say this, Myron. All of us, countries, big, small, whether you're Europe, US, or China, or Singapore, smaller countries, we all use technology, and we all want to regulate technology and try to regulate technology and deal with the tech giants. It's an issue, and all of us want the same things, I think, though we have different starting points. We want our citizens to be safe. We don't want online, we don't want falsehoods, we don't want online harms, we want children safety protected on the internet. Now, the thing is, what do? The United States has a laissez-faire approach towards this, you know, and the Europeans, they put a lot of emphasis on the individual, the protection of the individual, consumer protection, and I think data privacy. And if you look at the Chinese model, what China does is, you know, is for state good, state control, and common good. Then there are countries like Singapore, you know, which say, we're for the greater good, we're pro-innovation. We try to take what's best out of these and we come out with our own model and you try to work out something. But we really do think, whilst each of us are coming up with our own data protection acts, you know, and Europe has just come up with the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act. Is it possible to have some global rules developed? Can G20 do something about this? You know, they can start discussing digital rules. There must be rules of the road. You know, we had WTO, and it deals largely with the old economy. Now is a new economy, it's a new age. We should have a place where we come to talk about digital rules of the road for the new age. And, you know, Singapore, I am constantly advocating that everybody should be at the table. You cannot develop rules where the United States and China are not at the same table. I mean, two really large economies, you know. So if they are going in different ways, it's not for the good of all. So my position really is that we should try to have a table. I think G20 is a good place to start this conversation and come up with rules of the road. And I'm sure individual countries would also add on their extra sets of rules.
So the G20 is a good place, but it's also becoming a harder place because of Russia in it. And because of the Chinese role with Russia as a consequence. We'll see how that plays out in Indonesia going forward. The Ukrainians,
I think they've come up with some kind of compromise about bringing in Ukraine as well.
No, I know it's going to happen.
How would you, if you're looking at it from the lens of the United States, how would you approach these issues?
Look, I think in the conclusion of my book on issues of disruptive technology and AI, I actually say we need a world data organization. I agree with that. Mm-hmm. How do you start it? Is it going to be through the G20? Probably not. It's probably going to be the United States, the Europeans, Asian allies, and then hopefully with that framework, you say that countries like China are allowed to join if they are prepared to accept certain ground rules and standards. And that can be opening certain chapters and components. It doesn't have to be all in or all out. And I think the WTO framework is a useful exemplar of what could be done with the World Data Organization. Look, part of the reason why this isn't happening right now is because the Europeans have a more effective rule set for citizens, but they have no companies. And those two things are related, right? I mean, that you can't create AI innovation to the same degree in a European framework as you can in the United States. So it's going to be challenging to get from here to there, but I think it's essential that we do, because look, when we do a genetically modified food, we test it on before we roll it out. When we do a therapeutic or a vaccine for a new disease, we test it before we roll it out. We're rolling out algorithms that are actually affecting the thought processes of our children. And there's no regulatory process to test it before we actually roll it out. That's an obscenity, frankly. And it's happening because the institutions don't exist and the corporate business models are antithetical to themselves promoting such a model. So yeah, I think on that one, the Americans need to look to other countries that frankly care more about these issues and are vested more in these issues. And we're going to have to, if we don't move in relatively short order to create that framework, which will need to be created by other countries, not the United States, but friends of the United States, then American civil society and democracy will erode much faster than it already has, perhaps irrevocably. And as much money as we're all making on this call, I really don't think that's in our interest. I really don't.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to just say this has been a pretty sobering review of some of the geostrategic issues that we all are confronting and thinking about on a daily basis. Ambassador Chan, leave us with some optimism for this global audience, but quickly, leave us with some optimism, and Ian, I'll ask you to give us some optimism as we break.
I take comfort in that younger people I see everywhere, they are becoming far more engaged, and certainly they are very much aware of the environment, the planet Earth, and climate change. And they are taking a very strong stance on this.
Ian?
This last book I've written is, believe it or not, my most hopeful. It's called The Power of Crisis. And when you, for decades, watch political institutions domestically and global architecture erode, you recognize that business as usual isn't going to get you to where you need to go. You need a crisis. And we are presently in a crisis-rich environment. We are facing increasingly disruptive climate change, increasingly disruptive artificial intelligence, increasingly disruptive pandemics, and a war with Russia. And if those things are inadequate to force the kind of structural changes we need, then we're not going to be here very long. I tend to take the positive side, that I think that when humanity is really pressed, that's when we get innovative. That's when we start making the decisions that before we didn't need to bother to. I think we're going to take advantage of these crises, and I already see it happening on climate. I think it's going to happen in other places too.
Well, I won't use the term Sputnik moment, but I will say we need a Marshall Plan to respond to some of the challenges that you outline in your book. I want to thank Ambassador Chan. I want to thank Ian Bremmer for a fascinating, somewhat sobering conversation, but they left us with some hope and optimism, and we look forward to the rest of the panels today. Thank you both for being with us.